So as Dan said, my name is Jenna HOFFSTEIN. I am the founder of Little Worlds Interactive, and we're developing The Counting Kingdom, which is a math game for kids. I'm here today to talk to you about educational games, about the current state of game design for educational games, and why and how we can do so much better. So I want to start with a little bit of an aside. When I tell people outside of the games industry that I make games, they react as if I'm some sort of magical unicorn. A real person in the flesh who actually makes games, and on top of that, I'm a woman who makes games. That's just astonishing to many, many people. My husband is a high school teacher, and he loves telling his students that his wife makes video games because it just boggles their impressionable young minds. But in the past year and a half, I've noticed a change. When I tell people that I work in the games industry, I get that same really excited reaction. But when I specify that I'm making a math game, you can just see their interest evaporate immediately. And I usually have to be like, no, wait, I promise this is a fun game. But it takes so much effort on my part to actually convince people of that. So I'm not here today to talk about that reaction being wrong at all. I'm actually here to talk about how we can do better, how we can get to a place where the average gamer doesn't equate educational game with terrible game. So I'll be talking about educational games from a game design perspective. My background is game design. I am not an educational researcher, so that is not my specialty. So we won't really be talking about the educational side of it too much here today. We'll be focusing on the design. And here's where I want to start. Most educational games from a game design perspective are just terrible games. I'm not saying this to be needlessly controversial. I'm not trying to create a Twitter firestorm. But this is the reality of where we currently are, and we need to talk about how we move forward from this. So why do I say that most educational games are bad? This structurally is what most of them look like. Most educational games are quizzes with some layers of metagame wrapped around them, usually in the form of badges or level progression or some sort of achievements. And there's a reason why we keep hearing this term chocolate-covered broccoli used in reference to educational games. The educational part of this metaphor is the broccoli, covered with the chocolatey goodness of games to create something that, in my opinion, looks so much worse than either of those two things on their own. The metaphor illuminates a major problem with the current model of thinking about educational games, because it views the learning as something that's inherently awful. The learning is the broccoli, something that's known throughout the world to kids as gross. That's like the one food that kids just don't like, broccoli. It's something so bad that we need to wrap it in the sugary sweet goodness of games to make it even palatable. So why is learning the bad guy here? Learning is intrinsically rewarding. Studies have shown that our brain loves learning. That's what we're built to do. We naturally learn through play, and play is fun, and games at their core are structured play. So how have we gone horribly, horribly wrong? On top of that, every single game teaches you something. Usually they're teaching you how to be better at playing that particular game, but the point is that the structure of games has been built from the very beginning, from the very first game, to teach players, and we can tap into that and use it to our advantage. When we frame games this way, when we ask questions like, how do we gamify learning, we end up with this false dichotomy where we see learning as something bad, something that needs to be sweetened up by layering game elements on top of it. So how did we get here? This is kind of a larger talk, but I have a few suspicions. I think that a lot of these games are a holdover from the quote-unquote edutainment explosion that happened after games like Carmen Sandiego and Oregon Trail proved that there really was a market and there was money in educational games. We kind of saw a huge glut of really low-quality, quickly produced games just trying to tap into that money. There are also a lot of pressures right now relating to the current educational landscape. It's very, very assessment-based, and so that, I believe, is driving much more quiz-based games that are very easy to build this type of assessment into. And lastly, these types of games are very easy to build. That's just the reality of it. They're easy to pace out, they're easy to build assessment directly into, and when the pressures are on in terms of time or budget or both, and the pressure is always on, that's the easy path to follow. The problem is that educational games are competing in kids' lives with everything else. When they come home from school, they're making the decision, do I go outside and play? Do I play Temple Run? Do I play Angry Birds? Do I watch Frozen for the 57th time? And the reality is, if your game cannot compete in this decision, You have to rethink your gameplay. Your game has to be able to compete here. The fundamental truth that if kids are not engaging with an educational game, if they're not playing it, they're not getting the content out of it. So you can have the best educational content in the world in your game, but if kids play it for 5 minutes and are so bored that they just drop it and go run outside, they're not seeing it. So we need to make sure the game itself is a legitimate game, can hold its own against all of these other things competing for their attention. This is what we need. Educational games need to be awesome. They need to be fun, they need to be adventurous, they need to be exciting. When kids see these games for the first time, their eyes need to light up. That is the bar that we need to set for ourselves. We don't get a pass just because this is a hard design problem, and it is. This is in my opinion, one of the most challenging design problems we have in the industry. But we should put our bar as high as possible because we're talking about kids here, we're talking about education here. We don't get a pass. We need to pull this off to the very best of our ability. The chocolate-covered broccoli metaphor helps show us the problem. Most educational games completely separate out the content from the game mechanics, and they consider them to be two separate things. And the solution here is just that the mechanics of the game and the educational content need to be one and the same. They need to be intertwined in such a way that they can't be pulled back out. So just as a reminder, this is a quiz question. This is also a quiz question. Please do not do this in your game. I don't care how good you make this look. I don't care what theme you wrap around it. This is poor game design. So the reality, as I was saying before, is that making a really good educational game is a very, very difficult design process. You're trying to solve for two completely different goals at the same time, and they both have to be represented equally. You can't really let one get in the way of the other. So how do we do this? There's no silver bullet, of course, because game design is not a formula, it's a process. But the crucial process, as with most things in this industry for making an educational game, is play. Specifically, the process starts with playing around with the educational concepts because those are the very foundation of your game. So for me, this usually means sitting down with my paper prototyping kit, throwing ideas together, sketching, and really just seeing what comes out of that. So this potato photo, I apologize for the low quality, it's from my cell phone. That is the paper prototype for the Counting Kingdom. You can see the monsters coming down from the top. Those little color blocks represent castles, very high fidelity graphics, I know. Those are my little potions that I drew on the left. There's a reason I'm not an artist. I let somebody else make the art for my games. So the process has to start with the educational content. That's our foundation, and that is so incredibly important. But it has to grow from there into a structure and a context where you're doing something challenging and engaging and interesting and fun. Play is still sort of an amorphous concept, so I'm going to highlight a few specific questions that you should be asking yourself while prototyping to really keep yourself on the right track. And I'm going to talk about how we answered those with the Counting Kingdom, so I'll kind of use that as a case study along the way. So the first thing to ask yourself is, how can I structure this educational content in such a way that the player can take interesting actions and make interesting decisions? So in a game, we have a player who's overcoming challenges to reach a goal. That's kind of the fundamental structure of a game. And players can overcome these challenges by taking actions and making decisions. Interesting is not really a metric that can be measured. That's kind of the nature of game design. We're doing things that are very soft and fuzzy. This is something that you just have to feel when you're prototyping the game, and it's something that you have to prove out with your playtesting. So here's an example from the Counting Kingdom of what I mean by this. This is where I started. I knew I wanted to make a game about addition, but 3 + 5 = 8, that's not super interesting. So I sat down with my paper prototyping kit, threw things together, and here's what I came up with. We have on the left 3 possible sums, and we have on the right a grid of numbers that you can add up to equal one of these sums. There's a few tricks here, however. The numbers on the right need to be next to each other in order to be eligible to be added up. So for example, if you wanted to make, let's say 8, we could select the 5 and the 3. We could select the 2 and the 4, and then the 2 that's just to the left of the 4. So you can select as many numbers as you want. They just all need to be touching each other. On top of that, every time you make a sum, new numbers come in from the right, push the numbers to the left, and your goal is to prevent the numbers from getting off the left of that grid. So this was something that I just came up with by playing around, putting these things together, and this was something I found myself returning to and really enjoying. And that's exactly how the Counting Kingdom works. So you see that we now have the same grid of numbers, but this time they're monsters. We have the same sums on the left, but this time they're spells. The Counting Kingdom is turn-based tower defense. So you select monsters whose numbers add up to one of your spells, tap on the spell to cast it. Those monsters are then removed from the grid. A new wave of monsters comes in from the right, and you get a new spell. That is the fundamental core of the game. There are a number of mechanics layered on top of this. So for example, you can combine spells together to make larger spells. You can recycle a spell. You can use potions, that little purple bottle up on the left. Those can be used on monsters. But at its core, this is what my game is. Every time you make a move in the Counting Kingdom, you are doing addition. Every time you're trying to figure out what group of monsters to add up to a spell, that's all addition. Every move you're making is addition. But it's in a really engaging way. It's in a very strategic way. So you can see the move I'm about to make right here, 4 + 7 + 3, to cast the 14. Probably not the best spell because we've got those 4 monsters on the bottom row that are threatening that castle on the left. So what I have here is a valid move, but it's probably not the best move. So you always have to be thinking strategically. The second question I'd recommend you ask yourself when you're building this type of game is how can players use the educational content as a tool to overcome the challenges in the game? So very frequently we see the content presented in these games as a barrier to success, as something that the players need to either get over or get through or get past. So you might have a door that says, what is 8 + 3? And you have to solve that in order to get through the door. This is a question of mechanics, but it's also a question of just framing. What this does is this frames the math or whatever subject you're working in as the problem, as something that you have to get through, as a barrier. And Lord knows so many kids are already so traumatized by subjects like math. The last thing we want to do is put it in their way, is frame it as something that they have to get through, as something that is the problem. Instead, the subject that you're trying to engage them in should be their tool for doing powerful and awesome and great things in the game world. So in the Counting Kingdom, addition is quite literally your magic power. Addition is how you cast spells. You can see that here I must have had 4 monsters that equaled 19 because that's the spell I've just cast on those, and then more monsters will come in and I'll get a new spell. Addition is literally how you save the kingdom in our game. The last thing that I'd recommend that you think about is if players really tackle your educational content, if they're really like, I am on board, let's do this thing, and they go above and beyond, can they do something amazing in your game? If you have one of those kids who just is so on board and wants to do everything they can, they should 100% be rewarded for that. So this is one of the very early levels in the game. This is the Magical Meadows. Normally you would not get a 20 spell, but there's the mechanic in the game where you can combine spells together. So here I've combined 3 or 4 different spells to make a 20, and I found 8 different monsters which added up to a 20. This is a very high-level move in a very early part of the game. But if you want to push yourself, if you want to do this, the option is there. And what I've found in playtesting is that probably about 1 in 10 kids, as soon as they figure out how to play the game, they immediately jump to, what is the biggest spell that I can cast? And so I wanted to make that absolutely amazing. And there are a number of reasons why this is hugely rewarding. First, strategically, that's a great move. You're taking 8 monsters off the board at a time. That is probably the best move that you could make with this group of monsters. You get a ton of points for doing this. So every level has, the very basic 3-star ranking system, and this is what I would classify as a super badass move. You get a ton of points for it. And this is an epic move. I made sure that the particle effects for the spells get more and more exciting as you cast spells on more monsters. So the particle effects for casting a spell on 2 monsters is more exciting than 1, 3 is more exciting than 2. I think it caps out at 10 because I just couldn't figure out how to make it any more like explodey than it already was. It slows down and you get screen shake, and I kind of just gave up after 10. But the point is that players don't need to go this far. but we should 100% be encouraging them to do this. If they want to take that on, if they want to do everything they can with the content you're trying to deliver to them, that's the best case scenario. You have won. Congratulations. Like, you are doing what you should be doing with your game, and the kids should be rewarded for taking that action. So we really need to switch how we're thinking about this. We're not rewarding players with fun for learning. We're not saying, good job, little Susie, you figured out 2 + 3, here's a cookie. We have to let the learning be fun. If we set out to reward the players for learning, then we're viewing the educational content and the fun as 2 distinct things. And we need to be making sure that instead, we're making it fun and exciting to actually engage with the learning. So instead of chocolate-covered broccoli, I'd like to submit that we think about learning games as chocolate oranges. It's not a perfect metaphor, I admit, but I think it's incrementally better. The chocolate orange takes 2 delicious things, oranges and chocolate, and blends them together in such a way that they can't be pulled back out separately again. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know it's been a long 3 days. We're all tired. And thank you so much to Casual Connect for having me. And I think we have time for a few questions. Thank you very much. That is a great question. So I think for some of the young kids, there are some really great brands out there. So Toca Boca, I think, does really, really beautiful games. Endless Alphabet, I think, is very beautifully done. I think the reason why we see many more successful games for the young kids is because they focus on creating playful experiences. They're creating more digital toys instead of sort of proper games, if you want to get really critical about the definition of game. So for that age group, I'm seeing a lot more great games. For the older kids, sort of 6+, there's unfortunately not too much, and that's really what we're trying to change.
Yeah, have you looked at measuring player engagement in sort of a real-time way, the way that all the free-to-play games do, to make sure they're maximizing the profit from the players, but in this case, maximizing engagement in some sort of metric way?
So we do have analytics built into the game. Right now we're on Steam Early Access, so I wouldn't say that we have quite enough players to really pull super, super useful data out of it. The majority of my playtesting has been much more one-on-one, just sitting down with kids and seeing where do they get bored, where do they get stuck. If they do get stuck, how do they get themselves out of that situation? Can they? So my focus has really been on removing the hurdles as much as I can. When a kid does get the game, I've heard from so many parents that they have difficulty getting their kids to go to bed because they're just having so much fun. So we haven't done too much with analytics quite yet. That's something I'm hoping to do a little bit more post-launch. We're launching in just a few weeks, so hopefully we should have a nice big flow of data after that. The majority of my playtesting has been really just one-on-one as much as possible.
Hi, sorry I missed a few minutes at the beginning.
That's all right.
What are your thoughts on monetizing the educational games?
So this game is premium. I think particularly with kids games and particularly with educational games, there are many, many issues surrounding in-app purchases and the morality of that. And I think it's become a huge trust issue with parents. So the educational category in the App Store, in my opinion, is one of the very last places where it's a good thing to be a premium game. It can be very difficult from a design standpoint to make something that really is as engaging and as fun as possible while trying to put those in-app purchases in it. So our commitment is that the game is 100% premium, you pay up front, you have a very safe environment where you know your kid is not going to accidentally spend $100. And I think that's important to build that brand because parents know it's something that they can trust. I'm sure other people have different opinions on that, but that's how I feel.
How did you pick addition as your topic, and if this is super successful, which I sure hope it will be,
Thank you.
what topic would you pick for your next game?
So I went with math as my first topic because it has the beauty of being something that computers know how to do. So if you're trying to build a geography game, if you're trying to build an English game, you need to write those rules into the computer. Computers don't understand that purple, violet, tomato doesn't make any sense as a sentence. You would need to write those rules into it. Computers know that 1 + 1 does not equal 3. I don't have to worry about that. So it took a lot of the development burden off of my shoulders. And I thought that sort of as our first foray into educational games, that would be a huge help. And math is one of those subjects that parents get very anxious over. For better or for worse, if a student is not good at music, that doesn't worry parents in the same way as if they're not good at math. So this may sound super cynical, but from a marketing standpoint, I knew that would help us. It's also something that kids who struggle with math, that like follows them for the rest of their life. They just feel so negatively about it. And so I knew that if I could create a fun experience here and get them over that hurdle, that could have a very long-term positive effect. If this game does well, which I certainly hope it does as well, we'll see, I would love to tackle fractions next. I've been tutoring in a 3rd grade classroom, and fractions are just really hard, really incredibly hard, not only to learn, but to teach well. It's a very abstract concept, and I think it's something that's very, very ripe for a great game to jump in and just make that much less painful.
I wondered how you're handling privacy concerns with kids.
So we are not collecting any kind of personal data at all. All of the hooks that are built into the game are things like what spell did you cast? Did you cast it successfully? Did you not cast it successfully? Did you start a level? If you did you complete that level? Did you win? Did you lose? So we're not grabbing any kind of personally identifying information, names, locations, anything like that, so that we're fully COPPA compliant. So it's purely focused on gameplay, which has been really interesting because we're on Steam currently, and about 2/3 of our reviews have been adults talking about how much they're enjoying playing the game. It's really tapped into this kind of casual gamer group on Steam that has just loved it, which is phenomenal. So that does make the analytics a little bit more tricky because I really never know the age of the average person who's going through the game. Any last questions? All right, thank you so much.